At Louisiana State University, a geneticist named Mark Batzer has spent more than a decade running one of the largest population studies ever conducted on a single American ethnic group, a study that eventually grew into a multi-million-dollar research effort backed by federal and state funding, and he did not start in a laboratory. He started going door to door. Batzer, a professor of life sciences at LSU, working alongside researchers from the LSU Health Sciences Center in Tulane, built his study on something most population geneticists never get: near-complete church and family record-keeping, stretching back more than 250 years. What his team found when they mapped the genetic structure of the Cajun population of Louisiana against the population of France was a signal so specific it surprised even the historians who had spent careers on this story. The bloodline had barely moved. It had been deported, scattered across 3 continents, rebuilt from almost nothing in a Louisiana swamp, nearly legislated out of existence by its own state government within living memory, and it's still traced back to 2 small regions of France that most Americans, including most Cajuns, have never heard named. For comparison, the much larger founding population of French Canada, roughly 8,500 colonists who settled Quebec starting in 1608, is now estimated to have produced somewhere in the range of 8 million living descendants across North America. The Acadian founding population was smaller than that from the start, perhaps a tenth the size, which means whatever genetic signal it carried was always going to concentrate faster and show up sharper on a test 3.5 centuries later. To understand what Batzer's team found, you have to understand where this population came from before any of them ever saw Louisiana. In the early 1600s, French colonists settled a region of eastern Canada they called Acadian, the marshy tidal basin around what is now Nova Scotia. The genealogical record on these founders is unusually precise because French colonial administrators and later the Catholic Church kept detailed marriage and baptismal registers almost from the beginning. Genealogists tracing those registers have identified the founding Acadian population at roughly 1,000 individuals, drawn overwhelmingly from 2 specific regions of western France: Poitou, an inland farming region south of the Loire, and Normandy on the Channel coast. Much of that founding population arrived together, recruited and shipped out of the port of La Rochelle under an expedition led by a French nobleman named Isaac de Razilly, starting in 1632, bringing farming families from in and around his own home region of Anjou and neighboring Poitou to rebuild a French colony that had already changed hands between France and England twice in its first 3 decades. Some of the very earliest arrivals were not settlers at all, but Breton, Norman, and Basque fishermen who had already been working the cod banks off Newfoundland for a century before any formal colony existed. From that base of roughly 1,000 founders, the Acadian population grew for 150 years, marrying almost entirely within its own tight cluster of families along the Bay of Fundy, building dikes to farm the tidal marshland, and in many documented cases, intermarrying with the Mi'kmaq people whose territory they had settled inside of. If your family carries a surname like LeBlanc, Landry, Thibodeaux, Hebert, Boudreau, Comeau, Robichaux, Doucet, or Godet, and traces back to South Louisiana or the maritime provinces of Canada, you are very likely looking at a direct line back to one of this same small cluster of founding families. A genetic genealogy project founded in 2006 specifically to trace those Mi'kmaq Acadian family lines has spent nearly 2 decades untangling just how many modern Acadian descendants carry a documented native North American ancestor from those first generations in Nova Scotia. That relationship was, by the standards of European colonization in North America, unusually cooperative. The Acadians adapted Mi'kmaq knowledge of the land to their own dike-building agriculture, traded with Mi'kmaq communities rather than displacing them outright, and in generation after generation of parish records, priests recorded marriages between French settlers and Mi'kmaq women without the kind of documented violent conflict that defined English settlement further south. It was a coexistence built on 2 small populations, sharing a hard coastline neither one could fully control, and it left a genetic signature in Acadian descendants today that predates every part of the story that came after it: the deportation, the exile in France, and the resettlement in Louisiana. Then, in 1755, the British colonial government, having just gained full military control of the region from France, ordered the removal of the entire Acadian population. Historians call it le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. Soldiers gathered families at gathering points along the Bay of Fundy. The most infamous of them, the church at Grand Pré, burned their farms and dikes so there would be nothing to return to, and loaded them onto ships bound for ports across the British-American colonies, with no consistent plan for where any family would actually land. Estimates of how many were deported range from just over 10,000 to as many as 18,000 people, out of a population that had numbered perhaps 14,000 before the expulsion began. The first wave alone, in the fall of 1755, scattered roughly 6,000 Acadians across 9 different British colonies, with rough numbers on record for each: 900 to Massachusetts, close to 700 to Pennsylvania, more than 800 to Maryland, and 1,150 to Virginia, along with smaller groups sent to Connecticut, New York, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. Virginia refused to accept the Acadians assigned to it, and shipped all 1,150 of them onward to England instead, where they were held for years until the war that had displaced them finally ended, after which many crossed the Channel a second time into France. Colonel John Winslow, the British officer who oversaw the embarkation at Grand Pré, kept a journal recording the scene as families were forced aboard. Women in visible distress carrying children in their arms. Elderly parents carried out on carts alongside whatever belongings a household could gather in a few hours' notice. A first-hand account written by the man giving the orders, not by the families receiving them, and still one of the only detailed contemporary records of what that October actually looked like on the ground. Not every Acadian family was caught in the roundup. Several thousand escaped deportation entirely by fleeing north into New Brunswick, onto Ile Saint-Jean, or into French-held Quebec, on foot and by canoe, ahead of the soldiers. Families were split onto different ships without warning. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, and many of those separations were never repaired. It remains one of the largest forced population removals in North American colonial history, carried out against a civilian population that had lived on that land for 150 years. In 1847, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow turned the story of 2 separated Acadian lovers into the epic poem Evangeline, and it became one of the most widely read works of American literature in the 19th century, introducing the expulsion to a national audience that had mostly never heard of it, even as the real families who had lived through it were still rebuilding their lives in Louisiana. Roughly 3,000 of the deported Acadians eventually made their way to France itself, settling in 2 clusters that were not random: the Poitou region and the island of Belle-Île-en-Mer off the coast of Brittany, both places with old family ties back to the original 17th century immigration. France, it turned out, did not entirely know what to do with several thousand impoverished refugees who considered themselves French, but had spent 5 generations building an entirely different life across the Atlantic. In 1785, roughly 1,600 of those French-based Acadians boarded a fleet of 7 ships bound for Spanish Louisiana in an organized migration historians now call the Expedition Particulière, financed and arranged with the Spanish crown, which had taken control of the Louisiana colony from France in 1762 and was actively looking for loyal, Catholic, agriculturally skilled settlers to secure its new territory. It was, in effect, the third government in 50 years to decide where this population should live, after Britain expelled them and France failed to fully absorb them. Other Acadian families reached Louisiana by more scattered routes, starting as early as 1764, some by way of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean, some directly from the British colonies where they had first been dumped after the expulsion. Spanish authorities granted the arriving Acadians land in the prairies and bayou country west of New Orleans, ground nobody else particularly wanted at the time, swampy, difficult to farm by the standards of the day, and functionally left alone by colonial authority. It was, in almost every practical detail, the same isolation strategy that had shaped the population back in Nova Scotia a century and a half earlier, marginal land nobody was fighting over, left to a population that had already proven, twice now, that it could turn marginal land into a working farm and a functioning community faster than anyone expected. The English name for these settlers was a simple mispronunciation of the French word for what they already called themselves, Acadian, Cajun. The earliest arriving families settled what became known as the Acadian coast, a stretch of riverfront parishes along the Mississippi upstream from New Orleans, land the Spanish granted quickly because they wanted a loyal buffer population between the city and the interior. As more Acadian refugees kept arriving through the 1780s, later families were pushed further west into the prairies and marshland around what is now Lafayette, into St. Martin, Vermilion, and Iberia parishes, the region now known collectively as Acadiana. The families settling the river parishes and the families settling the prairie parishes were, genetically, drawing from the exact same narrow founding population. Geography split them into river Cajuns and prairie Cajuns. It did not split the bloodline underneath either group. Batzer's population genetics work has found that this isolation, first on the tidal marshes of Nova Scotia, and then in the bayou country of Louisiana, left a measurable genetic signature. The founding population was already narrow when the expulsion happened, and after 1755 it narrowed further as the same few thousand families found each other again in France and later in Louisiana and continued marrying largely within the group. Geneticists studying founder populations call this the same thing they call it in Quebec's own French-Canadian population, which descends from a separate and larger founding group of roughly 8,500 French colonists, an ordinary and well-documented pattern where a population that stays genetically closed for generations ends up carrying certain genetic markers, including certain disease-linked mutations, at rates far higher than the general population around it. This is not a metaphor for the Cajun bloodline running true. It is a specific, measurable, and medically relevant fact. And it is precisely why Batzer's team built its genetic study on top of church records, instead of starting from a spreadsheet of anonymous DNA samples. Knowing exactly which founding families a given Cajun household descends from, generation by generation, lets researchers connect a genetic marker showing up in a hospital in Lafayette today all the way back to a specific handful of individuals who left Poitou or Normandy in the 1600s, something that is almost never possible with population genetics research anywhere else in the country. Researchers have identified a founder mutation in a gene called USH1C, responsible for a form of profound deafblindness known as Usher syndrome type 1 that traces to a small number of shared ancestors in both the Acadian and the Quebec French-Canadian populations that split from each other genetically more than 3 centuries ago and reconverge today only in this one shared founder mutation from before the split. A separate and far more common example is Friedreich's ataxia, a hereditary neurological condition. In the general American population, roughly 1 in 100 people carries a single copy of the mutation without ever developing the disease. In the Acadian population of Louisiana, peer-reviewed research has found that carrier rate rises to roughly 1 in 70, and geneticists have traced the specific extended genetic marker behind it to a single shared ancestral haplotype running through the founding Acadian families. The same narrow founder population showing up again, this time in a medical record instead of a family tree. Direct address for a moment to anyone watching who has Cajun ancestry and has ever wondered why certain conditions seem to run in extended family networks that go well beyond a single household, showing up in a cousin's family, then an aunt's, then a name 2 branches over that everyone at the reunion already half expected. Populations that were forcibly isolated, whether by colonial expulsion, geographic remoteness, or religious segregation, consistently carry measurably higher rates of specific inherited conditions, not because of anything unique about the people, but because of simple population mathematics. A small founding group, repeatedly marrying within itself for generations, will always concentrate whatever rare mutations happen to be present in the original founders, the same way it concentrates a surname, a style of cooking, or a dialect. Batzer's ongoing work at LSU, funded in part by the National Institutes of Health, is specifically cataloging which conditions show this pattern in the modern Cajun population, using the same detailed church and family genealogies that make Acadian ancestry some of the best documented in North America. None of this is unique to Cajun families specifically. It is the same mathematics behind elevated genetic conditions in Ashkenazi Jewish communities, in the Amish, in island populations from Iceland to Sardinia. What makes the Acadian case unusual is simply how well documented the founding population is, and how cleanly historians can trace exactly when and why that population narrowed at each stage. If you have watched our videos on the Scots-Irish and Border English signal running through Appalachia, or on the families of Newman's Ridge who built an entire alternate ancestry to survive the law, you already recognize the pattern underneath this one, too. A small population gets pushed into isolation, whether by mountains, by a slur, or by a deportation order. And the isolation itself becomes the thing a genetic test can still detect centuries later. The mechanism is always the same. Only the history attached to it changes. What makes the Acadian case distinct is that the isolation was not an accident of geography. It was imposed twice, once by a deportation order in 1755, and once by a state legislature in 1921, and the population rebuilt its identity from scratch after both. Subscribe to the channel right now if this is the kind of breakdown you came here for, the kind that traces a population's DNA back through the actual historical record instead of stopping at a percentage on a screen. We do this every week. If your Ancestry DNA test came back with a French or Western European component and a documented family line running through South Louisiana, Nova Scotia, or the maritime provinces of Canada, the population your test is most likely detecting is this one, not a generic French signal spread evenly across the country, but a specific narrow founding population from Poitou and Normandy that has been marrying largely within itself since the early 1600s, surviving a forced deportation that scattered it across 3 continents and rebuilding itself twice. Once in exile in France, and once more in the swamps of Louisiana. Some of those same family lines, through documented intermarriage with the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia in the earliest colonial generations, also carry a smaller and equally well-documented native North American line running alongside the French one, present in the genealogy long before the expulsion ever separated the population from the land it had built. Your test will show you a percentage. It will not show you which of these 3 chapters that percentage actually belongs to: the original marshland colony, the exile in Poitou and Belle-Île, or the resettlement in a Louisiana swamp nobody else wanted. And it will certainly not tell you that a state government once tried to legislate the language attached to that percentage out of existence within your own grandparents' lifetime. The deportation was not the last time this population's identity came under direct legal pressure. In 1921, more than a century and a half after the last Acadian ships reached Louisiana, the state rewrote its constitution to require that all instruction in Louisiana public schools be conducted in English. In practice, that one sentence meant Cajun and Creole and Native children were routinely punished for speaking French in their own schoolyards, a practice that continued in parts of the state into the 1940s and 1950s. An entire generation grew up being taught, sometimes with a ruler across the knuckles, that the language their grandparents had carried across an ocean and rebuilt twice was something to be ashamed of. By 1960, researchers studying the region found that most Cajun children simply no longer had a reason to fear that punishment, because so few of them still spoke the language at all. It took until 1968 for the state to reverse course when Louisiana's governor created a state agency called the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, known by its acronym CODOFIL, specifically to bring French language education back into public schools after decades of deliberately erasing it. Today, linguists estimate well over 100,000 Louisiana residents still speak French or Cajun French, concentrated in the same parishes their deported ancestors settled in the 1760s and 1780s, in a language that the state itself once tried to legislate out of existence within living memory. What survived all of this is not just a bloodline in a language. Cajun cuisine, gumbo, boudin, a roux built the way it was built in a swamp kitchen with whatever was on hand, developed specifically out of the adaptation of French cooking technique to Louisiana. Ingredients: alligator, crawfish, and rice, none of which existed in Poitou or Normandy. Cajun and the related Creole-influenced Zydeco music, built around the accordion and the fiddle, carries melodic lines musicologists have traced back to French folk tradition, reshaped by 3 centuries of isolation and, later, by contact with the Black Creole communities of the same parishes. None of it looks like 17th century France anymore. All of it is still recognizably descended from it, the same way the DNA is. The site at Grand Pré in Nova Scotia, where so many Acadian families were gathered before being forced onto ships in 1755, is preserved today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the few places in North America where a forced deportation of an entire civilian population is memorialized on that scale. 270 years later, the population that was marched off that land has not just survived. It rebuilt an entire culture in a Louisiana swamp nobody else wanted, watched a state government try to legislate its own language out of its children's mouths less than 100 years ago, and rebuilt that too, gave the country its own cuisine, its own music, and its own language, and its DNA, when geneticists finally sat down and mapped it against the parish records of Western France, had barely changed at all. Every stage of this story was a small, narrow population getting scattered, punished, or ignored, and closing ranks again anyway. Nova Scotia to Poitou, Poitou to Louisiana, a schoolyard where French was forbidden to a classroom today where children are taught it again on purpose. Run the test, trace the parish, move on. The bloodline was deported, it was legislated against, it was never erased.